Ever feel like you're just dragging yourself through the day?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you're battling some mystery aches and pains,
Yeah.
but everyone's just like, welcome to being an adult.
Right.
So today, we're diving into a book that throws that whole like grin and bear it mentality right out the window.
Yeah.
It's called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Maté.
Oh, yeah.
And
I love this book.
oh, it's such a good one.
It's a perspective shifter for sure.
Totally. And one of the things that Maté argues in the book is that our modern culture itself is often toxic. Yeah. Which sounds a little dramatic when you first hear it.
It does.
But he backs it up with this biopsychosocial model of health.
Right. And that's really the thing that's so important to understand about this book.
Yeah.
It's not just about our genes or what we had for lunch.
Right, right.
It's really this interplay
Mm-hmm.
of our biology, our psychology,
Huh?
and, yep, you guessed it,
Our environment.
our social environment.
So like our workplaces, our relationships, even just the constant barrage of news and social media,
It all plays a part.
all of that factors in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where his thinking about trauma gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because he doesn't just talk about huge life-altering events.
Hmm.
He introduces this concept of a trauma spectrum.
A trauma spectrum.
Yes.
So there's like levels to this.
There are. So you have big T trauma,
Okay.
which are those major events like abuse or war.
Gotcha.
But then he also talks about small T trauma.
Okay. So like what falls into that category?
These are the subtle, often overlooked ways that we disconnect from ourselves
Mm.
in response to everyday stressors.
Oh, okay. So give me an example.
Well, think about a time you felt pressured to say yes
Mm.
when you really wanted to say no. Or
Yeah.
maybe you're constantly pushing down feelings of anger or sadness because you don't feel safe expressing them.
Yeah.
These might seem like small things, right?
Yeah.
But over time, that disconnection from your authentic self can really have an impact on your well-being.
It's so true. And I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling of like kind of betraying yourself in those moments.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that Maté even talks about
What's that?
how he himself,
Oh, really?
even Gabor Maté, will have these like deep-seated trauma responses
To like
What-
small
to
things.
small things.
Get out.
He has this whole anecdote in the book about how a simple text message
Wow.
triggered this like cascade of anxiety.
That's wild. It's like we're all just walking around with these like unconscious patterns
Okay.
that we've developed often as coping mechanisms.
Yeah,
And they just creep into our daily interactions without us even realizing it.
and they might have helped to survive a stressful childhood or a demanding job,
Totally.
but they can really backfire
Yeah.
later down the line.
Showing up as anxiety,
Anxiety, depression,
physical ailments.
all connected, right?
It's all connected.
Like our minds and our bodies aren't these separate entities. One of the things that Maté talks about that I find so fascinating
Yeah.
is how our emotions, especially those that we repress,
Mm-hmm.
can directly impact our physical health.
Okay. I've heard of that before, but how does that actually work?
Well, he talks about these nurses in a neurology ward,
Okay.
and they started to notice this pattern.
What's that?
The patients who were overly agreeable,
Like really nice.
like really nice people-pleasing,
Mm-hmm.
always putting others' needs before their own.
Yeah.
Those are the patients that often went on to be diagnosed with ALS.
ALS.
That's a pretty striking correlation,
Wow.
right?
It really makes you think about all that repressed anger and frustration.
Could it be manifesting physically?
Yeah. And he doesn't just rely on anecdotes.
No,
He brings in the science, too.
He talks about Candace Kurt.
Candace Purr.
Her work was groundbreaking.
What did she study?
She scientifically proved the link between emotions and physical health.
So it's not just all in our heads.
It's not just in our heads.
If we're constantly suppressing these emotions, like anger or sadness, we're actually creating physiological changes in our bodies.
She found that emotions are carried by these things called neuropeptides.
Oh,
And these neuropeptides are like chemical messengers that travel throughout the body,
interesting.
influencing everything from our immune system to our gut health.
So those suppressed emotions aren't just disappearing. They're like brewing a storm inside.
That's a great way to put it.
Which makes Maté's critique of the traditional medical model make a lot more sense.
Yeah,
It's like he's saying, instead of just treating the symptoms, let's look at the root cause.
exactly. He uses this metaphor of a leaky faucet.
Okay.
The traditional model focuses on fixing the leak. But what about the broken pipe?
Right. It's like we're just slapping a Band-Aid on a much deeper issue.
Exactly.
So we've talked about how our culture can be toxic.
Yes.
And that trauma, even in its subtle forms, can have this lasting impact on our health.
Absolutely.
But where do we see this myth of normal causing real harm?
Well, childhood is a prime example.
Okay.
Maté argues that So many of the practices we consider normal these days are actually at odds with children's biological and emotional needs.
So let's talk about kids.
Let's do it.
Maté introduces this concept of child honoring.
Right.
Which, on the surface, sounds kind of like a given, right?
Right.
Who wouldn't want to honor their child?
Of course.
But he's getting at something much deeper here, isn't he?
He is. He's talking about creating an environment where children's fundamental needs are met.
Which are?
Things like security, attachment, and the freedom to express themselves authentically.
Which I'm already thinking of a million ways that modern life gets in the way of that.
Exactly. He contrasts that ideal with the reality that many kids face today.
Which is?
Overstimulation.
Yep.
Pressure to achieve.
Definitely.
Early exposure to technology.
Way too early.
It's such a different world than the one we evolved in.
Right. He talks about the evolved nest. This idea that for millions of years, human babies were constantly held breastfed on demand, surrounded by these loving caregivers. And now we've got babies being left to cry it out, rigid feeding schedules, parents who are often stressed and distracted themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a lot to think about.
And I think the thing to remember is that it's not about judging anyone's parenting choices.
No, not at all.
It's just about asking ourselves, what if we're approaching childhood from a place of control and convenience rather than truly understanding a child's needs?
That's a great question. And I think even if you don't have kids,
absolutely,
this stuff is still relevant because, well, we were all children once.
We were all children once.
And those early experiences really do lay the foundation for our adult well-being.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've got the biopsychosocial model, the trauma spectrum, the evolved nest. It's a lot. But I'm curious to dig deeper into some of the specific ways that our modern world, this toxic culture, as Maté calls it, impacts our health.
Let's do it.
What do you think?
Where should we start?
Well, I mean, we can't talk about modern life without talking about technology.
Of course not.
Especially social media. It's like this double-edged sword.
Totally.
On the one hand, it connects us in ways we've never been connected before.
It does.
But on the other hand?
It can be incredibly addictive.
Oh, yeah.
And detrimental to our mental and physical health.
Yeah, it's like this constant comparison game.
It is.
We're bombarded with information. We're comparing ourselves to others.
Seeking validation through likes and comments.
Yes.
Right.
It's exhausting.
It is.
And it's like we're trading genuine human connection for this really shallow, fleeting sense of belonging.
And it's that search for belonging that leads us to the conversation around addiction.
Because addiction is more than just drugs and alcohol, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
For Maté, it's a coping mechanism. It's a way of numbing out from the pain of disconnection and unmet needs.
So it's not a moral failing.
No.
It's not a lack of willpower.
He sees it as a symptom of a much deeper issue.
Which is?
A society that isn't meeting our basic human needs.
For things like?
Connection.
Connection, meaning belonging.
And he speaks from experience here. Right?
She does.
He's really open about his own struggles with workaholism.
Which he sees as a form of addiction.
It's that tendency to overwork, to use work to numb out emotional pain.
To gain validation.
And it all goes back to childhood.
Often, it's those early experiences that create the foundation.
It's like he says in the book, it's that analogy about the boiling water.
Oh, yeah.
The heat represents the stressors and traumas we encounter.
And the pot.
The pot represents our capacity to handle it.
Our resilience.
And so some pots are made of these sturdy materials, and they can withstand the heat.
But others
are more fragile, more prone to cracking under pressure.
Because of
those early experiences.
Trauma, neglect.
Abuse.
It really makes you think differently about addiction, doesn't it?
It does. It's about shifting from judgment to compassion.
Yeah, not blaming the individual, but understanding the underlying pain and those societal factors that contribute to these behaviors.
And so if addiction is a symptom, what are the root causes?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
It is. And Maté spends a lot of time in the book talking about the limitations of the current medical model.
Okay.
He thinks it focuses too much on labeling and categorizing.
Instead of
understanding the underlying causes.
It's like that story he tells about Katerina.
Katerina.
Yes. Her seemingly delusional thoughts actually had a much deeper meaning.
Right.
It was all rooted in her childhood experiences.
And this deep need for control.
Right.
But the medical professionals were so focused on diagnosing her
That they missed the opportunity to really understand the source of her suffering.
They were trying to fix the leak without looking for the broken pipe.
And he argues that so many mental health diagnoses, like depression, anxiety,
even schizophrenia,
can sometimes be traced back to
what?
Trauma,
Okay.
stress, unmet needs.
So it's not that these experiences aren't real.
No.
But we need to look at them in a different light.
He sees them as adaptations to a challenging environment.
It's a totally different way of thinking about mental health.
It is.
We'll be back right after this quick break to discuss more about the myth of normal.
Sounds good.
So before the break, we were talking about those pathways to healing.
Yeah, those ways to move away from that myth of normal.
Exactly. And one of the things that Maté talks about is this idea of healing through disease.
Oh, yeah.
Which sounds kind of counterintuitive.
It does, right.
Because we think of illness as something to be avoided at all costs.
Right, like our goal is always to prevent disease to fight it off. Yes, exactly.
But Maté is suggesting that maybe we've got it all wrong.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
What if instead of just seeing illness as this terrible thing, we also saw it as a potential catalyst for growth and transformation?
Like a wake-up call almost.
Exactly.
Okay.
He tells this story about a woman named Donna Zmenek.
Okay.
And Donna, she's diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And basically she's told to get her affairs in order.
Oh, wow.
But Donna, she has a different idea.
That's it?
She's like, nope, not how my story ends.
I love that. What does she do?
She dives headfirst into this world of self-healing.
Okay.
She takes a hard look at her life.
Yeah.
You know, her stress levels, her emotional patterns, her diet.
Okay.
Everything.
Makes sense.
And she makes some radical changes.
Wow. And what happens?
Decades later, she's thriving.
Get out? No way.
Yeah.
That's incredible. It's like she literally healed herself.
It really makes you think about how we often view serious illness, like this enemy that we have to fight.
That war on cancer mentality. But maybe that's part of the problem.
Maté seems to think so.
Hmm.
He thinks that combative mindset can actually be counterproductive.
How so?
Because when we're so focused on fighting,
Yeah.
we create all this fear and stress.
It just puts our bodies into overdrive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when we're constantly in that fight or flight mode,
Yeah.
it actually weakens our body's natural ability to heal.
It's like we're adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not about giving up or resigning ourselves to illness.
Right.
It's about finding a more balanced approach.
Like working with our bodies instead of against them.
Exactly.
And I imagine that looks different for everyone.
Absolutely. Maté talks about a lot of different therapeutic approaches.
Like what?
He's a big proponent of internal family systems therapy.
IFS, right?
Yeah, have you heard of that?
I have, but I'll be honest, I don't fully understand it.
Okay, so imagine your inner world is like a family
Okay.
with all these different parts.
Okay. I can see that.
All right, so you have parts that are playful and spontaneous, parts that are responsible and organized, parts that are scared and hurting.
Right, like a real family.
And sometimes these parts, they clash.
Yeah.
And that's when we see things like anxiety and depression and unhealthy behaviors.
So with IFS, you learn how to work with those different parts of yourself.
Exactly. It's about fostering self-compassion
Okay.
and creating a more harmonious relationship within yourself.
Instead of just trying to get rid of the parts we don't like.
Exactly. We learn to accept them, to understand them.
That's really interesting. And alongside that inner work, Maté also talks about reconnecting with our emotions.
Yes, even the messy ones.
Like grief and anger.
Especially grief and anger.
Mm-hmm.
Because those are the ones we're often taught to suppress.
Right, like, don't be so sensitive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But those emotions, they're trying to tell us something important.
They're like messengers.
Right. Grief helps us process loss.
Mm-hmm.
Anger can motivate us to set boundaries.
Okay.
It's when we try to bottle those emotions up that they become a problem.
That makes sense. And it's worth mentioning that Maté is also a proponent of psychedelics for healing.
Right. He's talked about his own experiences with ayahuasca.
Yeah.
And he believes that these substances, when used responsibly and with proper guidance,
Of course.
can be powerful tools for transformation.
For sure. It's not about endorsing drug use.
No, not at all.
It's about recognizing that there are many paths to healing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what works for one person might not work for another.
Totally.
Yeah.
So if someone's listening to this and they're realizing like, wow, my childhood was really different from that evolved nest, or maybe they're seeing how those early experiences are still impacting them today,
Right.
where do they even begin to heal from that?
Well, I think a good starting point is self-compassion.
Okay, talk to me about that.
It's about meeting ourselves where we're at
With all our imperfections.
All our baggage, yeah.
Yeah.
And offering ourselves the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a loved one.
It's like we're becoming our own best friend.
In a way, yes.
Or our own loving parent.
Exactly. It's about filling those gaps.
Providing ourselves with the nurturing and support that we may not have received earlier in life.
And that can be incredibly powerful.
So we've talked about healing through disease. We've talked about IFS. We've talked about reconnecting with our emotions. What else does Maté suggest people can do?
Well, he talks a lot about the importance of reconnecting with our bodies.
Okay.
With nature, with each other.
It's like that evolved nest idea again.
It is, right? We're wired for connection, for community, for being in nature.
And so much of modern life pulls us away from those things.
Exactly. We're glued to our screens.
Yep.
Isolated in our homes.
Working longer hours.
Right. So it's about consciously counteracting those forces.
Like putting down the phone.
Yes.
Getting out in nature.
Spending time with loved ones.
It sounds so simple.
It does.
But I imagine it's not always easy.
It's not. It takes effort.
But it's worth it.
It is, because those connections, they're essential for our well-being.
And it's not just about individual change either, right? Right. Maté's not just saying go meditate and everything will be fine.
He's talking about systemic change, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He talks about creating a more just and compassionate society.
One that prioritizes
well-being.
Over connection over competition.
Right. It's about looking at the bigger picture.
And asking ourselves some tough questions.
Like, what kind of world do we want to live in?
And what are we willing to do to create it?
Exactly. It's a call to action.
It's about recognizing that we're not powerless bystanders in this toxic culture.
We have a voice.
Yeah. We have agency.
And we can make a difference.
And sometimes that starts with simply questioning those stories we've been told about what's normal.
Exactly. What if we could rewrite the narrative?
Create a new myth.
One that actually supports our well-being.
I love that. So we've talked about these broader societal changes.
Yes.
But let's bring it back down to the individual level.
Okay.
What are some other specific things that people can do in their own lives to start moving away from that myth of normal?
Well, we've touched on a few things, but I think it's worth exploring those in a bit more detail.
It sounds good to me. Let's take another quick break and then we'll dive back in. Okay, so before the break, we were talking about those more individual pathways to healing that Maté talks about.
Yeah, like what can we do in our own lives?
Exactly. And, it's interesting because he brings it all the way back to childhood.
Always back to childhood, right?
I know, right?
Okay.
But he really seems to believe that those early experiences have this huge impact on our lifelong health and well-being.
He even goes so far as to challenge, like, the medicalized approach to childbirth.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about it, right? All those interventions.
Yeah, all the machines and the monitors.
Exactly. And while they can be life-saving in certain situations,
Of course.
Maté argues that they often disrupt those natural hormonal processes of labor and birth.
Which are there for a reason, right?
Exactly. And that disruption can have lasting impacts.
Wow. On both mother and baby.
On both of them. And he talks a lot about the importance of creating this calm and supportive birthing environment.
Which makes me think about the evolved nest again.
Right. It's like from the moment we enter the world.
Are kind of thrown off course.
In a way.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the birth itself either.
It's the postpartum period, too.
Exactly. That time after the baby's born
Yeah.
is crucial.
He's a big advocate for skin-to-skin contact.
Oh, absolutely. That immediate contact between mother and baby helps to regulate so much.
Their temperature, their breathing.
Everything. Plus, it's just this beautiful bonding experience.
It is. It's like that first imprint of love and security.
Exactly. And Maté suggests that even those things that seem really small,
Like what?
like sleep training methods that encourage parents to let their babies cry it out.
Which a lot of people swear by.
I know, but he presents it as potentially really disruptive to a child's developing nervous system.
Interesting. So even those early experiences can be a form of trauma.
In a way,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think even if you didn't have that ideal evolved nest upbringing,
Yeah.
it's never too late to start healing those wounds.
So where do you even begin?
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, self-compassion.
Okay, talk to me about that.
It's about recognizing that we all have these wounds.
Yeah, nobody gets through childhood unscathed.
Exactly. And instead of judging ourselves for those wounds,
We can offer ourselves kindness and understanding.
exactly, it's like we're becoming the loving parent we always needed.
That's beautiful. And I imagine that's a process, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not a one-time thing. It's something we have to cultivate over time.
So we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the limitations of the medical model, the importance of understanding trauma, the power of reconnecting with ourselves with nature, even the potential of things like psychedelics for healing.
It's about opening up to new possibilities.
Exactly. So where does Maté leave us?
You know, I think the main takeaway from the myth of normal is that we have a choice.
A choice about how we want to see the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how we want to show up in it.
Do we want to keep buying into this myth?
This idea that suffering is inevitable.
That we just have to grin and bear it?
Or do we want to challenge that narrative?
To create a new story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One that's more aligned with our values.
With our humanity.
With our potential for healing and growth.
It's a powerful message. And it's a reminder that we're not alone in this.
We're all in this together.
And by supporting each other, sharing our stories, questioning the status quo.
We can create a world that's a little bit closer to that evolved nest.
A world where normal means something truly extraordinary.
I love that.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure as always.
And for everyone listening, we encourage you to check out The Myth of Normal by Gabor Maté.
It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What are you questioning? What news stories are you ready to write?
Join the conversation on our social media channels.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.